the older, more life experience someone has, the more you actually have experienced the circular economy, because the intention and what we need to shift to is towards an economy where products last much longer. We actually have much more skills in our society to repair them. It is easier to do so, and things are easy to actually disassemble, remanufacture, refurbish, and are in the loop. So it's a reuse economy, it's a remanufacturing economy, but it's also an economy which in some extent is more local, which is interesting, I think, for the local side of things. So, and that's really a hard area, because it's, if you look at the way currently the whole system operates, and I'm not even talking about financially, but I'm talking about kind of the design of talking about reduce, reuse, recycle, is the reduce and reuse is seen as the most important, but it's getting the least amount of action. Both from a legislative perspective in terms of targets, but also at the local perspective. We're now for the first time seeing in North London that some of the councils are starting to think about hiring a circular economy officer. Not a recycling officer, not a waste prevention officer, but a circular economy officer, someone who will have reuse and reduce and waste prevention much more prominently in a more holistic setting on their agenda. And this is a slow movement. And it also relates to trying to find new ways of doing things. And this is the hard part. There's a lot of barriers that relates to, for example, I was talking today with some councils, and they're looking at, can we create a space, a circular economy hub for building materials, so that when a building gets demolished locally, there's another building site that's where there's new buildings constructed, and they should be matched. What we need is some brokerage and a space to store the materials from one site and then move to the other site, and a matching of which materials matches. And that's where a lot of challenges come in, because space is costly to store those materials. There's not necessarily existing knowledge about those materials and their quality. The reuse of steel beams or materials or bricks is not something that's done in a standard way. So we're coming across different challenges, and we need to kind of, in that sense, I think there's a long list of potential solutions or opportunities, but the tricky part of the local side is, how do you foster that, and how do you make that happen? Another example on the local level that is, I think, quite interesting is community composting, which in London is not something that is very common. It's very common in other countries. In France, when I tell people that in Amsterdam there's such a thing as a worm hotel, meaning that there's a hotel where people can bring their food and there's worms, and 16 families share one, and you get the key and the kids can come and see the worms, because it's all kind of an educational thing as well. It's something that's new, and how do you establish that? And how do you make that happen? So you have kind of a lot of examples and opportunities locally, and it's a bit of in that sense, a lot of experimentation is required. And that's where I think those what's really needed are kind of a lot of initiatives, councils that are willing to facilitate those initiatives, citizens that get excited about some of those initiatives, spaces for businesses to get some funding to initiate and to become self-sustainable over time. And that's something that we're trying to find out now in England, a bit more of the model to make that happen. So I think we're at the start of these efforts, and a little bit helped here and there by legislation, but there could be more done. But also it requires really a shift in mindsets locally. It's not something, sometimes you see, okay, as long as the legislation is put in place, everything will work. Well, that's not really how it works. It requires people to be excited and to want to do new things also with local materials, like and making new things. There's a whole area around, I think, how this is going to end, make things more sustainable. So I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done that's not yet fully done if you look at it from a climate change perspective, but also an environmental footprint perspective. There are quite a few studies, but they're not consistent on how much actually reuse, refill, and also recycling, but waste prevention, how much better that is in terms of just virgin materials and just importing things. And we don't really have that readily available. But things are starting to become a bit apparent. So for example, I live in Hackney. So I don't live in Enfield, but I live in Hackney. Hackney carried out a carbon emissions study of, okay, what is the percentages? They hired some consultants. What are the percentages of emissions associated with what happens in our borough? And the biggest ticket item in that study, 48%, was citizens' consumption. It wasn't transport, it wasn't buildings, it wasn't that. It's citizens' consumption of stuff, of anything, the flows. And the second interesting point of that study is that Hackney has said, this is too complicated. It relates to people's behaviors. We're going to park that, and we're not going to work on that. We're going to work on buildings, transport, etc., etc. So this is an interesting kind of mentality. It's a big item, and it's probably maybe even an underestimate because we don't account for a lot of things that happen in the manufacturing elsewhere. So because that's something that is often not accounted for because it's not happening in the UK. So it doesn't really matter. We have no influence over it. That's the kind of theory, right? But we do have an influence over what happens elsewhere by purchasing in sustainable supply chains or by preventing imports and producing things more locally. So that these are possibilities. And I think that's where things start to kind of over time will start to become more and more clear how these things relate, and there will be more and more engagement because of that. And that leads in the long run to an economy where we are actually shifting towards an economy where everything is almost recycled, which is becoming technologically possible, either mechanically and to an extent chemically, where we are shifting towards a lifespan extension, a very large lifespan extension of some appliances. In the conversations I have with manufacturers is they can produce super durable appliances, but they don't, because it costs them too much in their business model. So these are the kind of areas where you get hard limits. And that's where you need to shift towards service models. That's shifting a bit away from the local economy. But I think that's the broader picture where at some point that's where legislation needs to come in. Yeah, there's so much you can do locally, and then the legislation comes in if the bigger supply chains. And part of it's also around having the ability to create local jobs and local workshops. So for example, hard plastics. Everyone chucks away hard plastics. It's actually fairly easy to recycle hard plastics. The only thing that's hard is you need to have a sorting robot. Yeah, and you need to have sorting mechanisms to distinguish whether it's polypropylene or LDPE or a PET, etc. And then you can actually create plastics granules. You need an investment, but it could be easily done in North London with the right investment. And that can also be done at a smaller scale. So that's something that can be done, and not in terms of hard plastics recycling. It's actually, in that sense, more easy to decentralize it. Or the same with replacements of plastic objects to things that can be locally made. Just an example, almost anything that's a container or anything that is, here's another artisan example. You know, you all have some of these objects as well, but it's not common. And the limits there are related to cost. So this is also where we, in the discussions around this, is you have to, it's not a cheap, you know, it's not cheap. It's not something that is mass produced. It's something that's artisanal, as seen as such. I think that should be changing. And that relates a lot to the structure. I think that's where the other limits come in to the local circular economy, is the structure of wages. As long as we don't have an economy where we pay people properly, and I think more than the living wage, then it's very hard to have a local circular economy, because people will not be able to afford those locally produced goods. And that relates a lot to more equality. If we have more equality, so people who have a lot of money, and if that's more equally distributed across society, it makes it much more possible to have local supply chains. That's not something that has been properly analyzed, which is interesting. The whole relationship between, I think, equitability and the possibilities to have local supply chains and local jobs is something, at least as far as I know, it's not something that's very commonly ground analyzed, but I think that's where also we have a limit to such initiatives. So there's a lot possible, but at some point it hits a limit in terms of, because people will otherwise, logically, they will purchase the £3 thing over the £15 thing if your wages are very low. So I think that's also important, I think, in the broader context. And so there are things that can be done. I think, to summarize, I have 2 more minutes before we go to questions. There's quite a lot of examples of what can happen locally. I mentioned the Worm Hotel, these type of initiatives, spaces for trading building materials. And that doesn't have to be at a very complicated scale. If you go to the skips next to a building site and you do a survey of that, there's quite a lot of local building material. They're already graded, but they go now to somewhere typically outside of London where they're sorted. There is actually a site in Enfield where that happens, but it's not embedded in the local economy. So it's not localized to what can we do with that wood that's collected, or what can we do with that bricks that's collected within Enfield. And Enfield, in that sense, is quite interesting, because there's a lot of economic activity like that happening. Also, there's a car shredding facility in Enfield with metals. There's a lot of metals that are being processed in Enfield. But what happens with those metals? They go outside of Enfield, so it's doesn't come back into the local economy, into manufacturing. So those are kind of examples of things that could be looked at, I think, on food waste. I mentioned the example of plastics materials. They could be made into all kinds of items, as well as artisanal. And then we also talked about kind of limits to that because of the way the economy is structured in general, in terms of wages, and also in terms of incentives. So this also matters a lot. We see that now, I think with some legislative changes, that there's more incentives, but there needs to be more, and that's where pressure comes in, I think, in campaigning and other efforts. I'll stop there, but hopefully that was interesting.